On January 5, 1942, while Tokyo still echoed with shouts of victory, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto summoned the senior staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet. Reports from Malaya, the Philippines, and the southern offensives suggested that Japan would soon dominate East Asia. Yet Yamamoto, even in the glow of triumph, felt none of the euphoria gripping the capital. He quietly instructed his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Mato Megaki, to complete the plans for Japan's next phase of war by mid-February, warning that every passing month reduced Japan's chances of long-term success. The astonishing speed of Japan's early conquests shocked even Tokyo's most ambitious planners and ignited bitter disagreements within the Imperial General Staff. Many hardline nationalists argued that Japan should continue expanding as long as victory came easily, pushing deeper into the Pacific regardless of risk. Yamamoto, however, belonged to the smaller camp of realists, men who understood the danger of fighting industrial giants in a prolonged war. His caution was no secret. Friends in Tokyo had even convinced him to stay aboard the battleship Yamato, fearing extremist officers might assassinate him for arguing openly against an endless war with the United States and Britain. Ugaki recorded in his diary that what Japan needed now, after its month of triumph, was not more conquest but statesmanship. Yamamoto shared that view. He believed Japan's leaders, especially Prince Kono, had dragged the empire into a conflict without fully understanding what kind of war they intended to wage. Months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had warned his friend Ryoichi Sasakawa that although early victories would come swiftly, like an octopus spreading its arms, the initial triumphs would be fleeting. Now, barely 4 weeks into the war, Japan's tentacles reached from Malaya to the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. And yet Yamamoto reminded Sasakawa of what he had predicted: the moment of opportunity would not last. He believed the real chance for Japan to negotiate a favorable peace would come after the fall of Singapore, a blow he was certain would shake British power across Asia and stir unrest in India. His experience gave weight to these warnings. He had worked closely with the British during the London naval conferences of the 1930s and knew the Americans intimately from his years as naval attaché in Washington. He understood both nations far better than most officers in Tokyo. He agreed that once Japan chose war, a decisive early victory was essential, but he insisted Japan would have only 18 months after that victory to secure peace before American industry buried them. From the outside, however, January 1942 looked like the peak of Japan's power. The U.S. battleship fleet lay crippled at Pearl Harbor. The pride of the Royal Navy had been sunk off Malaya. Manila and Cavite had fallen. Hong Kong was lost. Japanese forces were sweeping toward Rabaul, Ambon, and the Solomons. Yet Yamamoto's unease persisted. The Pearl Harbor attack, brilliant as it was, had failed in one critical objective. The American aircraft carriers had escaped. As long as those carriers remained at sea, they represented a threat no Japanese plan could ignore, a threat that would soon shape the future of the entire Pacific War. As January unfolded, the question that dominated Tokyo was simple yet dangerous: where should Japan strike next? Yamamoto urged an offensive into the Indian Ocean, a bold move that would force the British fleet into a decisive battle, open the door to Ceylon, and ultimately link Japan with advancing German forces near the oil fields of the Caucasus. It was the grand strategy he believed could secure the resources Japan desperately needed. But the army, stretched thin across China and Southeast Asia, refused to commit to such a distant campaign. That left two options. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo pushed for an invasion of Australia, believing that eliminating Australia as an Allied base would cripple American plans to strike northward. The plan was massive: seize the Solomons, push into New Guinea, advance through New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and ultimately isolate the entire continent. Occupation blueprints were already being drafted. Yet Yamamoto opposed it. It would take too long, drain too many resources, and worst of all, fail to produce the kind of shock that could force the Americans into negotiations. He believed the United States, stirred by Pearl Harbor, would not be intimidated by a slow strangulation of Australia. What he needed was a spectacular blow, something so decisive that it would break American morale before Washington's industrial might fully awakened. And so, with characteristic boldness, he conceived the MI plan, a sweeping trap at Midway intended to destroy the remaining American carriers. Alongside it, he prepared the AL plan for an invasion of the Aleutians to distract and divide American forces. If both succeeded, Hawaii might fall, and the West Coast could one day be threatened. With such victories, Yamamoto believed, peace might become possible. But events moved faster than any plan. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 bombers lifted from the USS Hornet and struck Tokyo itself, an attack Yamamoto never expected so soon. Though the physical damage was minor, the psychological shock was immense. The strike humiliated the Army, enraged the Navy, and erased any remaining sense of invulnerability. To Yamamoto, it confirmed what he already knew: the Americans were far from defeated, and the window to negotiate peace was closing rapidly. The Midway Plan was approved amid this atmosphere of panic and pride. No one in Tokyo considered that the fall of Singapore in February, or the imminent collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, might have served the same political purpose Yamamoto sought. Everything now centered on the coming battle. Victory at Midway, the admirals believed, would restore Japan's aura of invincibility. What followed instead was catastrophe. In early June, while the American landings at Tulagi and Guadalcanal were still unthinkable, Yamamoto sailed east expecting triumph. But within a single day, Japan lost 4 of its frontline carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The scale of the defeat was so devastating that Imperial headquarters concealed the truth from nearly everyone in the Army, claiming victory while the combined fleet struggled to grasp the enormity of what had happened. Yet even as the Midway disaster unfolded, Japanese forces in the South Pacific were still advancing. They captured Rabaul in January and rapidly transformed it into a major air and naval base. Australian and American forces watched in growing alarm as Japanese aircraft bombed New Guinea daily, preparing for a drive toward Port Moresby. The next step, everyone understood, would be Northern Australia. In May, the Japanese attempted exactly that. Their Port Moresby invasion force sailed south, only to be checked in the Coral Sea, the first major carrier battle in history. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle forced Japan to abandon the Port Moresby landing. Still, the Japanese seized Tulagi and built a seaplane base there, extending their reach deeper into the Solomons. To the Americans, this trend was unmistakable. General Douglas MacArthur warned the Australian government that a Japanese thrust into Australia was imminent. He pleaded with Washington for carriers, planes, and troops, but the U.S. Navy, stretched thin and still recovering from Pearl Harbor, could only spare 2 operational carriers until late June. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already begun detecting signs of a major Japanese move, which turned out to be the Midway operation. Thus, even as Japan prepared to strike at Midway, its commanders in the South Pacific, unaware of the coming disaster, continued planning the next stage of their advance. They assumed the combined fleet would return victorious to cover new operations that would push toward New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, and eventually isolate Australia. The Army and Navy both believed the Americans were still reeling, still weak, and still months away from mounting any serious counterattack. They had no idea that within weeks, the first Allied offensive of the Pacific War would begin, an assault that would land not on a distant beach, but on a small, half-finished Japanese outpost called Guadalcanal. As the smoke from Midway still hung over the Pacific, Japanese plans in the South Seas moved forward, untouched, unaltered, and dangerously unaware of how vulnerable they had suddenly become. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas force had landed at Salamaua, New Guinea, and the Japanese Navy had begun transforming Lae into a major air base. From these outposts, they intended to resume their drive toward Port Moresby, preparing for a renewed offensive in July, after what they believed would be Yamamoto's decisive victory in the Central Pacific. The Imperial General Staff, convinced Midway had been another triumph, did not hesitate. They ordered Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake to press ahead with operations stretching through New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. The plan was to sever the supply lines that linked Australia to the United States. Once those lifelines were cut, Australia would be isolated, and the Allies forced onto the defensive across the entire Southwest Pacific. Meanwhile, MacArthur was preparing for the worst. Reports from Australian intelligence warned that Japanese forces were massing in New Guinea and the Solomons. By late June, after the chaotic Coral Sea engagement, it became clear that the Japanese intended to consolidate their grasp on the region before launching their next major push. MacArthur urged Washington to authorize a preemptive strike against Rabaul, the nerve center of Japan's South Pacific operations, but his request for carriers, planes, and a full amphibious force was impossible to fill. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs weighed the desperate situation. The Japanese had momentum, experience, and vast numbers of aircraft in the region. The Americans had only 2 fully operational carriers in the entire Pacific. Yet Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, refused to sit idle. He crafted a daring plan, a limited offensive through the Lower Solomons using naval forces under U.S. command. It was a gamble, but delay, King argued, would give Japan the window it needed to strike Australia. King's proposal set off an uncomfortable clash of egos and responsibilities. MacArthur wanted full control of any offensive, but the Joint Chiefs judged that such an operation required naval leadership. They assigned Phase 1, seizing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions, to Admiral King's command. Amid this planning, Guadalcanal remained a nameless, seemingly insignificant island, just another spot on the map. But everything changed in early July, when intelligence from coast watchers and codebreakers revealed that Japan was constructing an airfield near Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. The discovery alarmed everyone. A Japanese base there would allow enemy bombers to strike deep into the South Pacific and threaten shipping to Australia. More importantly, it would become the springboard for Japan's next advance southward. Nimitz reacted immediately, dispatching orders to ready an amphibious task force. And within 2 weeks, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner arrived in Wellington to assemble a hastily thrown-together invasion fleet. His flagship, the USS Macaulay, an old converted passenger ship, became the nerve center of America's first major amphibious operation of the war. As Turner reshuffled troops and supplies, another key figure entered the scene, Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, appointed commander of the South Pacific Forces. Gormley arrived with doubts weighing heavily on him. He believed the operation was premature and dangerously under-resourced. When he met with General MacArthur in Melbourne, both men agreed that the landings were nearly impossible to support with existing aircraft. They sent a strongly worded appeal to Washington urging postponement. But Admiral King was unwavering. America's first offensive operation would proceed, ready or not. The Japanese had to be stopped before they reached Australia, and every day lost brought that threat closer. By late July, the race was on. Almost 20,000 Marines were rushing toward the Solomons from bases across the Pacific. Yet no one in command truly felt ready. Supplies had been loaded haphazardly. Landing rehearsals were chaotic failures. And worst of all, the carriers, vital for air cover, were unreliable, damaged, or under strength. On July 28, commanders gathered aboard the carrier Saratoga for the first full operational briefing. The atmosphere was tense. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, responsible for protecting the invasion, announced he would keep his carriers in the area for only 48 hours. He believed the carrier force was too vulnerable to Japanese land-based aircraft. Turner argued fiercely, warning that without longer air coverage the Marines would be left exposed. But Fletcher had already made up his mind. Despite the bleak rehearsal at Fiji, where only a third of the troops reached the beaches and confusion reigned, the invasion timetable could not be changed. There was no turning back. On July 31st, the Marines reboarded their transports and headed toward an island none of them had heard of just weeks earlier. For 2 days, the fleet sailed under overcast skies that shielded them from Japanese patrols. On August 6th, heavy rain and squalls continued, hiding the armada as it closed in on Guadalcanal. And then just before dawn on August 7th, the skies cleared. The first U.S. offensive of World War II was about to begin. And the Japanese still had no idea it was coming. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the calm of the Solomons shattered as American carrier planes roared in low over Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese, accustomed to total dominance across the Pacific, were stunned into disbelief. Their early morning routines, preparing seaplanes, organizing patrols, setting breakfast fires, were interrupted by explosions that tore across the airfield construction site, the seaplane anchorage, and the nearby troop positions. Within minutes, communications from Tulagi sent a frantic message to Rabaul: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. It was the first warning Japan received of the Allied landings. From the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, waves of American fighters and bombers fanned out across the targets. They found no Japanese aircraft airborne. They circled freely over the islands, strafing runways, destroying seaplanes where they floated, and scattering shock troops who had never believed an enemy invasion force could reach this far. At Gavutu, pilots shot down several Japanese aviators attempting to take off. Every floatplane was destroyed before it could leave the water. Below, the Marines aboard the transports waited tensely. Many had never seen combat before. As naval guns opened fire, flashes from cruisers and destroyers lighting the shoreline, the Marines realized the invasion was truly underway. When landing craft churned toward Guadalcanal's beaches shortly after 9 a.m., they expected heavy opposition. Instead, they found abandoned tents, half-finished barracks, and meals left on tables by construction crews who had fled into the hills. The Japanese had not believed an attack was possible. They had not even dug defensive positions. But while Guadalcanal offered a strangely easy beginning, the smaller islands across the channel told a different story. On Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's Marine raiders met fierce resistance almost from the start. The terrain was suffocating: dense vegetation, vines, thorns, and Japanese snipers hid in trees, behind rocks, or inside bunkers carved into the ridge. Edson's men advanced inch by inch, tossing dynamite charges into dugouts and fighting close-quarters battles against defenders who refused to surrender. By late afternoon, the raiders reached a ravine dominated by fortified Japanese positions that formed deadly interlocking fields of fire. Darkness forced them to halt, but the night offered no rest. At 10:30 p.m., the Japanese launched a sudden, ferocious counterattack that broke through the Marine perimeter. Fighting erupted in foxholes and along the narrow ridge: grenades, knives, rifle butts, all used in a desperate struggle. Some Japanese infiltrators got within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being cut down. When dawn came, the Marines had held, but at a heavy cost. The next day, reinforced American units pushed forward. They discovered Japanese machine gun nests dug into cliff walls and caves. Every position had to be stormed individually. In one dugout, they found 35 bodies, many long dead, some freshly fallen. The Marines quickly learned the brutal reality of Japanese combat doctrine. Positions were defended to the last man, and surrender was almost unimaginable. Across the water at Gavutu and Tanambogo, the situation was even worse. Troops landing mid-morning were met with a hail of machine gun fire. Japanese defenders had fortified the slopes of the island's central hills, and their positions overlooked every approach. Marines advancing up the ridges faced well-placed trenches and bunkers. The fighting became savage and intimate: grenades lobbed into caves, flamethrowers where available, and hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran low. Tanks landed in support, but Japanese infantry sprang at them, jamming crowbars under the tracks and thrusting gasoline-soaked rags into engine vents. One tank commander fired until he was stabbed to death through the hatch. Another tank was set ablaze by flames hurled inside. By late afternoon, the Marines were forced to call for urgent reinforcements. When those reinforcements attempted to cross the causeway between the islands, Japanese fire illuminated by a burning fuel dump cut them down. 2 boatloads of Marines were stranded under the pier, pinned until after midnight when more Marines arrived and finally secured the position. By the end of August 7th, the Japanese garrisons on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo had been annihilated. Not one of the roughly 500 defenders survived. But their resistance taught the Marines a brutal lesson. The enemy they faced would fight to the death, strike from concealment, and counterattack at night with terrifying ferocity. Meanwhile, the Japanese in Rabaul were scrambling to respond. Early that morning, 27 twin-engine Betty bombers and 18 Zero fighters had taken off, redirected from their original mission toward New Guinea. They reached the Solomons shortly after noon. American wildcats from the Enterprise dived into them, shooting down bomber after bomber. But the Zeros quickly intervened. In the chaotic dogfight that followed, several American pilots were killed, some after valiant duels in which they managed to send at least one Japanese aircraft into the sea before being overwhelmed. Zero Ace Saburo Sakai, already one of the most feared pilots in the Pacific, fought in this engagement. He shot down a Wildcat and an SBD dive bomber but misjudged another group and flew head-on into a web of concentrated rear gunner fire. His Zero was shredded, and he was gravely wounded, losing consciousness briefly before somehow managing to fly over 500 miles back to Rabaul. Throughout the day, coast watchers across the Solomons sent warnings of incoming raids, allowing American ships and fighters to prepare. By evening, dozens of Japanese bombers had been shot down, and only a handful had reached the beachhead. One transport, the George F. Elliott, was set ablaze. The destroyer Jarvis took a torpedo that crippled her. But overall, American losses were fewer than expected. On land, Marines securing the Guadalcanal airfield were astonished by how quickly progress was made. By the afternoon of August 8, they reached the edge of the runway the Japanese had begun constructing, soon to be named Henderson Field. Some Marines joked that the Japanese wouldn't stand and fight, unaware that the fiercest battles of the campaign still lay ahead. But the greatest danger that day was unfolding at sea. Admiral Fletcher, shaken by losses to his limited carrier air groups, convinced himself that further risk would jeopardize the entire operation. Acting without waiting for permission, he began to withdraw his carriers on the evening of August 8, just as Japanese naval forces under Admiral Mikawa were racing down the slot for a night attack of their own. The fate of the Guadalcanal invasion hung on the hours ahead. And the Americans had no idea the enemy was coming. As night fell on August 8, 1942, the Marines ashore felt a growing unease. They had seized the airfield, pushed inland, and secured footholds across Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. But the beaches were crowded with mountains of supplies no one had time or manpower to organize. The lack of Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal no longer felt like good fortune. It felt like a warning. Out at sea, Admiral Turner anxiously awaited word from Admiral Fletcher's carriers. Without them, the invasion force had no meaningful air cover. When Turner received Fletcher's terse message, the carriers were withdrawing early due to aircraft losses. His worst fear became reality. By the time Turner received the dispatch, Fletcher's carriers were already turning south, slipping away under cover of darkness, leaving the transports, support ships, and the Marines dangerously exposed. This sudden disappearance of American air power created the exact window Admiral Mikawa's Japanese task force needed. Earlier that afternoon, Mikawa's cruisers, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, had been spotted by American aircraft and the submarine S-38 as they moved down from Rabaul. But American commanders dismissed the sightings, assuming these were routine Japanese fleet movements. No one believed a major attack force was heading toward Guadalcanal. This misinterpretation of intelligence would soon prove disastrous. By late evening, Mikawa's column sprinted south through the narrow channel that would soon become infamous as the Slot. His ships cut through the dark waters at high speed, using moonlit breaks and dense clouds to stay undetected. Mikawa intended to launch a surprise night assault, one that played directly to Japanese strength. The Imperial Navy had trained extensively in night combat, torpedo attacks, and coordinated cruiser maneuvers. The Americans had almost no night battle experience at all. As the Japanese cruisers approached Guadalcanal, every factor favored them: darkness, surprise, superior night optics, and the Americans' complete lack of air reconnaissance. Even worse, the American task force guarding the approaches, cruisers and destroyers from Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S., believed no Japanese strike group was anywhere near the Solomons. Just after midnight on August 9, Mikawa's advance scouts sighted the silhouettes of the Allied screening force near Savo Island. Much of the fleet was unprepared. Many radars were on low sweep settings, some ships had lookouts distracted by the heat or terrain, and no one expected an attack. Signal confusion between Australian and American ships left no alarm raised. Mikawa acted instantly. At approximately 1:43 a.m., Japanese cruisers opened fire, their first shells streaking across the Black Sea in flaming arcs. Torpedoes, long lances, the most lethal in the world, slipped silently into the water and knifed toward the unsuspecting Allied ships. The carnage was immediate. The American heavy cruiser USS Quincy was hit repeatedly, set ablaze, and sank within minutes. USS Vincennes and USS Astoria were hammered by gunfire, shells detonating across their decks and igniting ammunition stores. The Australian cruiser HMS Canberra, caught in the first volley, was reduced to a burning, drifting wreck. The Americans barely managed to fire back. Some ships never fired a single round before sinking. Others launched desperate, uncoordinated responses in total confusion, thinking they were under friendly fire or misidentifying the attackers. For nearly an hour, Mikawa's cruisers circled Savo Island like predators, smashing every Allied ship that came into view. By the time he withdrew northward, fearful of a possible American carrier strike at dawn, the results were devastating. 4 Allied heavy cruisers sunk. USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, USS Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors killed. Many were trapped below decks or thrown into burning oil slicks as their ships capsized. It was the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. Yet despite his overwhelming success, Mikawa made one fateful mistake. He withdrew without attacking the vulnerable American transports lying off Guadalcanal, ships carrying almost all of the Marines' food, ammunition, and equipment. At dawn, he worried American carriers might be nearby. He did not know they had already left. The Marines, waking on the beach the next morning, had no idea what had happened offshore. But soon they saw smoke rising in the distance and heard the grim news. The Navy had been smashed, the carriers were gone, and the transports could not stay. On August 9th, Turner reluctantly ordered all remaining transports to evacuate as soon as unloading was complete. Marines scrambled to salvage whatever supplies they could. Many crates were left floating in the surf or abandoned on the sand. By the time the last transport withdrew that evening, the Marines were alone on Guadalcanal, with limited food, limited ammunition, and the Japanese already preparing a massive counterattack. The easy landings were over. Now came the real battle for Guadalcanal. The morning after the catastrophe at Savo Island dawned with a grim stillness. On Guadalcanal, Marines dug in around the captured airfield, soon to be named Henderson Field, unaware that the naval force meant to shield them no longer existed. As exhausted men hauled crates away from the beach, rumors spread. Ships had been sunk, cruisers lost, and the transports were leaving. By the afternoon of August 9th, Admiral Turner had only one choice. With Japanese bombers likely to strike again and the carriers gone, the transports could not remain. What supplies were already unloaded would have to sustain the Marines indefinitely. Food was stacked haphazardly across the sand, ammunition sat in exposed piles, and essential tools were buried under crates no one had time to identify. Turner reluctantly ordered the transports to withdraw. By sunset, the Marines could see the silhouettes of their last supply ships shrinking on the horizon. The feeling was unmistakable. They were stranded. Now the Japanese response was beginning. When the invasion news reached Rabaul, Japanese command immediately realized the gravity of the threat. Guadalcanal had been nothing more than a construction site days earlier, yet now, if the Americans held the airfield, they could dominate the sea routes between Rabaul and the southern front. The airstrip had to be retaken at any cost. The first reaction came on August 7th itself. Japanese bombers from Rabaul launched hurried attacks against the American fleet, flying more than 500 miles over open water. Most carried bombs instead of torpedoes because they had prepared for strikes on New Guinea, not an American landing. The long distances exhausted pilots and allowed American carrier fighters to ambush the bombers before they reached the target. But as the initial shock wore off, Japanese commanders gathered their strength for a sustained counteroffensive. In the following days, they pulled their air groups back to Rabaul, forming larger raiding formations. They also assembled infantry units at staging points across New Britain and New Ireland. Every available asset, from destroyers to scout float planes, was ordered to support the coming effort to reclaim Guadalcanal. Japanese reconnaissance began scouring the Solomons. the South Pacific skies filled with search planes probing for American ships. However, weather patterns shielded the Marines. Cloud banks and heavy storms often masked the island and the waters around it. Each day Japanese formations approached Lunga Point, expecting to bomb Henderson Field out of existence. But American defenders, armed only with carrier planes for the first 48 hours, fought them off as best they could. On August 8th and 9th alone, dozens of Japanese bombers and fighters were shot down. But American pilots paid a price as well, one that contributed to Fletcher's decision to pull the carriers away. Meanwhile, on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the Marines were still mopping up. Japanese survivors refused to surrender. Many hid in caves or attempted suicide charges at night. Raiders and parachutists fought cave by cave, clearing each hillside with grenades and demolitions. Every attack reinforced the Marines' understanding: this enemy would not break. While these local battles raged, senior Japanese officers at Rabaul began preparing a stronger answer to the American landing. They ordered reinforcements from throughout the South Pacific Theater, units from New Britain, the Carolines, and even the Dutch East Indies. More ships were rerouted to support the counteroffensive. Destroyers began to ready for rapid night supply missions, the runs that would soon be known as the Tokyo Express. But as Japanese commanders planned their next moves, they remained confident. In their view, the Guadalcanal landing was reckless, a desperate Allied gamble with little chance of success. Few believed the Americans could hold the island. Fewer still suspected that the airfield the Japanese had begun only weeks earlier would become the key to the entire Southern War. Yet American intelligence in the region remained fractured. Coordination between Army, Navy, and Australian air services was inconsistent. Search plane routes overlapped in useless areas while leaving the most obvious Japanese approach, the slot, uncovered. Messages were lost, misinterpreted, or delayed. As a result, even as Japanese cruisers and reinforcements surged into the Central Solomons, American forces ashore received almost no warning. The Marines waited behind improvised lines around Henderson Field, still unsure what was coming next. By the evening of August 9th, the stage was set. The Japanese, shocked but now mobilized, were moving with speed and determination. Reinforcements, bombers, and naval units all converged on the region. American carriers had vanished over the horizon, leaving the Marines alone. Every man on the island understood the crossroads they faced. Guadalcanal was no longer a small, local operation. It had become the opening chapter of a far larger struggle, one that would decide control of the entire Pacific. The initial landings were over. The long, brutal campaign for Guadalcanal had only begun.